He was found on a sidewalk in Kensington, Philadelphia, the body frozen in an unnatural, broken posture like a marionette with its strings cut. Passers-by paid no mind. Here, in this open-air market of human desperation, such a sight is merely part of the streetscape, not even worthy of a passing glance. The arriving paramedics followed their well-rehearsed protocol. Pinpoint pupils, barely perceptible breathing, cyanotic lips, the classic signs of an opioid overdose. One shot of naloxone, a second, a third. But the man wasn't breathing. His heartbeat didn't return. The drug that had saved hundreds of thousands of lives from heroin and fentanyl was completely powerless. That wasn't what troubled the emergency room doctors. They were struck by something else, the wounds. Deep, festering ulcers on his shins and forearms, with black necrotic edges, exuding a sweetish smell of decay. These wounds didn't look like typical injection marks. The skin and the flesh beneath it looked as if they were being slowly and methodically eaten away by acid from the inside. This was not just an overdose. This was something new, something monstrous. The name of this monster is xylazine. On the streets, it's called tranq, or the zombie drug. It is not an opioid. It's a veterinary tranquilizer developed in the 60s to sedate horses, cows, and other large animals weighing half a ton. It was never intended for humans. And now it is found in more than 90% of the street heroin and fentanyl in Philadelphia. The consequences of its use are horrific. Xylazine plunges a person into a stupor lasting for hours, practically a coma. In this state, they are defenseless against robbers, rapists, and even rats, which can gnaw on their numb limbs while they stand, bent in half, on a sun-drenched sidewalk. They feel nothing. But the most terrifying thing happens inside. The drug causes a sharp, catastrophic constriction of blood vessels, cutting off blood supply to the tissues. The skin begins to die. Necrotic ulcers appear, which can grow down to the bone, turning legs and arms into a rotting mess. Amputation becomes the only option. But this was just the tip of the iceberg of horror that tranq brought with it. Unlike fentanyl, whose euphoric effect is short-lived, xylazine extends the high for many hours. For drug traffickers, it's an ideal additive, cheap, legal for veterinary use, and allowing them to sell less of the main, more expensive substance. For the user, it is a death trap, turning addiction into a slow, agonizing process of rotting alive. The authorities were completely unprepared. Naloxone, the main weapon in the war against the opioid epidemic, is useless against xylazine. Fentanyl test strips do not detect it. Doctors don't know how to treat these horrific wounds, which don't heal for months and don't respond to standard antibiotics. The healthcare system, already overburdened, was faced with an enemy it did not understand. This is not just another drug. It is a chemical weapon unleashed upon the most vulnerable segments of the population. A weapon that doesn't just kill, but erases personality, turning a person into a living corpse long before their heart stops. And no one knew where it really came from or how to stop it. They thought they were fighting a drug, but in reality they had encountered a perfect predator created by the soulless logic of the market. To understand the nature of this madness, one must go back to 1962, to the sparklingly clean laboratories of the German pharmaceutical giant Bayer in Leverkusen. The world was on the threshold of a new era, the era of synthetic miracles, and the race to create a panacea for all diseases was in full swing. It was there, in search of a new breakthrough drug for hypertension, that a team of chemists first synthesized a compound called xylazine hydrochloride. The first tests on laboratory animals showed promising results. Blood pressure did indeed decrease. The next step was clinical trials on human volunteers. And this is where everything went off plan. Instead of simply lowering blood pressure, the drug caused a severe, uncontrollable depression of the central nervous system. Patients fell into a deep, almost comatose sleep, their breathing and heart rate slowing to critical levels. They became pale, cold, completely unresponsive. One of the lead researchers wrote in his report, "The subjects exhibit a state close to dissociative anesthesia, but without the analgesic effect. They are not asleep, but they are not awake either. It is dangerous and unpredictable." The project was immediately and quietly shelved. For human medicine, xylazine was officially deemed too dangerous and unpromising. The molecule was locked away in the company's archives, but the most dangerous monsters never stay in their cages for long. Pharmaceutical companies don't like to throw away their developments. Each synthesized molecule is worth millions. A few years later, in 1968, another company, Rompen, after studying Bayer's archival data, saw potential in the failed human drug for another market, for veterinary medicine. It was perfectly suited for calming an aggressive bull before an examination or performing a painful surgery on a prize horse. Powerful, reliable, predictable in animal dosages. Xylazine, which received the trade names Rompen and Anised, became the gold standard of sedatives for large animals. For decades, it saved lives in veterinary clinics around the world, allowing for the most complex procedures to be performed. No one at Bayer, Rompen, or in thousands of veterinary offices could have imagined that one day this reliable tool would begin to take the lives of their owners with monstrous efficiency. The first alarm bells rang not in the U.S., but thousands of kilometers away, in Puerto Rico, in the early 2000s. Local veterinarians began to notice a strange and frightening trend. Xylazine started disappearing from their clinics and from supplier warehouses. It wasn't disappearing by the vial, but by the crate. Soon, traces of it appeared on the streets of San Juan and Ponce, in the poorest and most crime-ridden neighborhoods. Local drug users, predominantly heroin users, began mixing horse anesthetic into their doses. They called it anesthesia de caballo. The effect was astonishing. The cheap powder, evaporated from the veterinary solution, greatly enhanced and, most importantly, prolonged the effect of low-quality local heroin. This allowed them to save money and to sink into a deeper, longer oblivion, escaping from the harsh reality of poverty and unemployment. It was there, on the streets drenched in Caribbean sun, but steeped in hopelessness, that the monster first showed its true face. Xylazine users began to develop those horrifying, non-healing ulcers. Local doctors in free clinics were horrified. They had never seen anything like it. But their warnings were drowned in the chaos of a long-standing drug epidemic. For the rest of the world, this problem simply did not exist. But it was from this Caribbean incubator that the virus would soon begin its deadly journey north. Philadelphia became the ideal beachhead for the invasion. A city with one of the oldest, largest, and most infamous open-air drug markets in the U.S., the Kensington neighborhood. This is not just a few city blocks. It is an entire ecosystem of despair, sprawling for miles, with its own economy, logistics, and laws. For decades, addicts from all over the East Coast had flocked here like moths to a flame. The turning point was the widespread proliferation of fentanyl in the mid-2010s. This synthetic opioid, 50 times more potent than heroin, almost completely displaced its predecessor from the black market. It was cheaper for cartels to produce and delivered a stronger high. But fentanyl had one serious drawback for the user. Its effect was very short-lived, requiring new injections every few hours. Life became an endless, grueling race for the next dose. It was at this moment that xylazine appeared on the scene, brought in, apparently, by Puerto Rican drug cartels that had established strong ties with Philadelphia gangs. For dealers, it was a revelation. By adding a cheap veterinary tranquilizer to expensive fentanyl, they not only increased the weight and volume of the product, but also gave customers what they craved: legs, that is, the duration of the effect. The mixture, dubbed trank dope, allowed users to pass out for 6, 8, even 10 hours. It was a brilliant and utterly inhuman business strategy. They had no idea they had created a perfect storm that would soon spiral out of control. The architect of this plague was not a single person. It was the soulless logic of the black market itself, compounded by user desperation and technological progress. The drug traffickers in Kensington are not chemists or pharmacists. They are businessmen operating in the most brutal and competitive environment imaginable. When fentanyl appeared, it destroyed the old heroin model. Profits were higher, but customers constantly complained about the short-lived effect. A filler, a cutting agent, was needed that would not just increase the mass, but also have its own psychoactive effect, creating the illusion of quality. Xylazine proved to be the ideal candidate for 3 reasons. First, it was cheap and accessible. It could be ordered in bulk from Chinese chemical companies, which sold it under the guise of raw materials for industrial use, or not for human consumption, easily bypassing lax regulatory barriers. Or it could simply be stolen from veterinary clinics, which were everywhere. Second, it was potent. Its heavy sedative effect perfectly mimicked an opioid high, creating the illusion for the user of a very high-quality, powerful product. Thirdly, and most importantly, it gave fentanyl legs. For a person living from fix to fix, whose life is governed by the tyranny of withdrawal syndrome, the ability to black out for 8 hours instead of 2 is priceless. Demand for trank dope skyrocketed. Dealers who continued to sell pure fentanyl began to rapidly lose customers. The market regulated itself, making the deadly mixture the new gold standard. They had created a product that sold itself, but this product had its own price, which they were not the ones to pay. The logistics of this new drug were simultaneously simple and brilliant in their cynicism. Unlike fentanyl, which is produced in clandestine superlabs in Mexico and crosses the border at great risk, xylazine often began its journey as a completely legal commodity. Large shipments of the powder were ordered from China under the guise of raw materials for the veterinary industry and legally imported into the U.S. or Mexico through standard ports without arousing any suspicion from customs. From there, the chain branched out. The main part of the powder ended up in the hands of cartels, which centrally mixed it with the opioid in their fentanyl production facilities, creating ready-to-sell trank dope. Another portion, in the form of a liquid solution for injection under the brand name Anised, was stolen or illegally written off at veterinary clinics and wholesale suppliers already within the U.S. The internet was flooded with offers to sell horse tranquilizer without a prescription. Any small-time street dealer could buy a vial and cut their own product, increasing its appeal to customers. It was no accident that Kensington in Philadelphia became the epicenter. It's not just a neighborhood, it's a logistics hub. The main drug trafficking routes of the East Coast pass through it. A unique, almost surreal infrastructure had developed there. Entire blocks where one could buy, sell, and use drugs almost openly, without much fear of the police, who had long since given up on the area, limiting their response to only the most violent crimes. When the first batch of trank dope arrived here, it spread like a virus in a perfect breeding ground, and what began as a local Philadelphia problem was ready to spill over into the entire country. The monster's spread followed the pathways of human connection and desperation. Drug addicts from other cities and states, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, Newark, came to Kensington for the best stuff on the coast. They tried trank dope and, upon returning to their hometowns, brought back not only memories of a powerful high, but also a physiological need for this specific mixture. They created a demand for it. Local dealers, in order not to lose customers, were forced to urgently find xylazine suppliers and start producing their own mix. Thus, step by step, city by city, xylazine began its triumphant and bloody march across America. From Philadelphia, it spread to neighboring Pittsburgh and Baltimore. Then it appeared in New York, Chicago, Detroit. Social workers and paramedics began to sound the alarm, reporting an avalanche of patients with inexplicable, horrific ulcers and overdoses that did not respond to naloxone treatment. But their voices were too quiet, and the system was too cumbersome. Federal agencies, such as the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, responded at a snail's pace. Xylazine was not on the list of controlled substances for humans. Formally, possessing it was not a crime, while the bureaucratic machine tried to grasp the scale of the threat, develop standardized tests for coroners, and change the laws. Precious months and then years were lost. The monster had already broken free and begun its bloody harvest across the country, and stopping it already seemed impossible. By 2021, Kensington had turned into a living embodiment of the apocalypse. The streets were strewn with people frozen in the characteristic trank pose, bent in half, as if their spines were about to break under an invisible weight. They stood like that for hours, stupefied, with saliva drooling down their chins, unresponsive to the outside world. This was not like the relaxed heroin nod. It was a complete, violent shutdown, a plunge into oblivion in broad daylight. For street outreach teams, this became a new daily nightmare. Previously, their main task was to distribute clean syringes and naloxone. Now they had to carry oxygen tanks because xylazine suppressed respiration in a completely different way than opioids, and naloxone couldn't reverse it. But the main, most shocking problem was the wounds. They saw people with fist-sized ulcers on their legs, exposing tendons and bones, teeming with maggots. The most horrific part was that the wounds didn't just appear at injection sites. Due to its systemic vasoconstrictive effect, necrosis could start anywhere, on the arms, back, even the face. People were literally rotting alive and often didn't even notice it while in an hours-long stupor. The medical system was paralyzed. These wounds required complex surgical treatment, skin grafts, and months of inpatient care, for which homeless drug users had no chance. They thought they had hit rock bottom, but xylazine showed them there was a whole other hell beneath it. The bloody peak of the epidemic began. Philadelphia's morgues were overflowing. Pathologists worked non-stop, but standard toxicology tests didn't provide the full picture. They saw lethal doses of fentanyl in the reports, but that couldn't explain why the bodies arrived in such a horrific state, with extensive tissue necrosis, as if from a World War I military medicine textbook. Only after the implementation of special expensive tests for xylazine did the scale of the catastrophe become clear. The veterinary tranquilizer was found in almost every body. For those who survived, life turned into unceasing torture. The withdrawal syndrome from the mix of fentanyl and xylazine was unbearable. To the classic opioid withdrawal, savage muscle pain, vomiting, diarrhea were added uncontrollable panic attacks, seizures, and a monstrous, all-consuming anxiety caused by the tranquilizer's withdrawal. This created a devilish, vicious cycle. People were willing to do anything to stop the torment and would again inject the poison that was killing them. A new kind of horror had taken hold on the streets. People were afraid of more than just the police or an overdose. They were afraid to fall asleep. They were afraid to wake up and find their last belongings, shoes, a jacket, stolen. They were afraid to wake up and see a new black spot on their leg that would turn into a gaping, stinking hole within a week. An atmosphere of total paranoia and hopelessness enveloped Kensington in a thick, suffocating shroud. It was a war for survival where the enemy was the very substance flowing through their veins. And in this war, there are no winners. Time slows down, thickens like tar. Here it is, that sacred moment before the injection. Hands tremble, not from fear, but from an animal, impatient withdrawal, from the anticipation of the silence that is about to come. Around you is a symphony of the urban underbelly, the distant wail of sirens, drunken shouts from around the corner, the dull, rhythmic rumble of a train on the overpass above. But inside you, the noise is even more deafening. It's the noise of withdrawal, twisting your insides into a tight, icy knot. It's the noise of shame, burning somewhere behind your breastbone. It's the noise of memories of another life, one that seems like a foreign film seen in distant childhood, where you had a job, a family, a future. The syringe, old, with a bent needle, fills with a murky beige liquid. It's not just a drug. It's your one-way ticket out of this cursed reality, at least for a few hours. The needle enters a vein in the forearm with difficulty, one of the few remaining that haven't turned into scar tissue. A light, almost gentle push of the plunger, and the poison rushes into the blood. Fentanyl comes first, a warm, velvety, all-forgiving wave of euphoria that instantly washes away the pain, the anxiety, the cold. For one short, blissful second, it seems that everything is fine, that the world has regained its meaning and color. But this is just a short prelude. Right behind it, like a heavy iron door slamming shut, comes xylazine. The world doesn't just fade, it disappears. Sounds turn into a viscous, underwater hum, colors blend into a dirty gray mess. Your body becomes alien, cottony, uncontrollable. Thoughts break off mid-sentence, unable to fully form. There is no past, no future. There is only a thick, impenetrable, soundless void. Consciousness doesn't disappear completely, and that is the main horror. It shrinks to the size of a tiny, terrified point, locked in a dark, felt-padded room with no windows or doors. From this inner prison, you watch as your body, now a will-less biological shell, begins to slowly lean forward. Your legs buckle but don't give way. The muscles freeze in an unnatural tension. Your head drops powerlessly onto your chest. There it is, the famous trank stance, Kensington's calling card. From the outside, it looks like a deep sleep while standing. From the inside, like locked-in syndrome, a paralysis in which you are still awake but cannot make a sound or a movement. You hear someone approach. You feel strange hands unceremoniously rummaging through your pockets, taking your phone, the last few crumpled dollars. You want to scream, to push them away, to wake up, but your body doesn't obey. You are a powerless spectator in the theater of your own humiliation. But even this was not the most terrible ordeal that Trank had in store for you. Hours pass, feeling like an eternity. The void begins to slowly recede, to thin out. First, sound returns. The intrusive, ear-splitting hum of the city you were so desperate to escape. Then, the pain. But not the sharp pain of withdrawal that the shot saved you from, but a new one. A dull, aching, deep pain in your shin. Consciousness slowly, creakily, returns to your numb body, and you force yourself to look down. On your worn-out jeans, a dark, damp spot that wasn't there before. And underneath, on the skin, a purple-blue bruise the size of a coin, which definitely wasn't there yesterday. It doesn't hurt when you press it. It's just there, cold and dead to the touch, like a piece of someone else's flesh. Everything inside you plummets with an icy, nauseating horror. You know what it is. You've seen it on dozens of others. This is the beginning of the end. This is the black mark of xylazine. The days blur into one endless, gray, agonizing cycle. Finding money, buying a dose, the shot, the plunge into oblivion, waking up. And every time you come to, you inspect your body with a primal fear. The bruise on your shin has turned black as coal. The skin around it has become thin, shiny, like parchment. Then it burst at the slightest touch, revealing the yellowish, oily tissue of subcutaneous fat. A smell appeared, the sweetish, nauseating, incomparable smell of rotting flesh. Your own smell. You try to wash the wound with water from a bottle, to bandage it with a dirty rag found in a dumpster, but it's useless. The ulcer grows every day. It deepens, devouring the muscle. Sometimes, changing the bandage, you see the white, gleaming tendons twitching in its gruesome depths. You start to limp badly. Every step echoes with a pulsating, tearing pain. But the pain of withdrawal, which hits every few hours, is even stronger. And so you look for a vein again. A social worker named Mike sees you on the street. He approaches carefully so as not to startle you. He has the kind but infinitely tired eyes of a man who has seen too much. He talks about some program, about detox, about a special wound care clinic opened by volunteers. You listen to him, you nod, but his words, full of sympathy and hope, don't reach your consciousness, bouncing off it as if from armor. A clinic? That means weeks, maybe months, without drugs. Weeks of unbearable physical agony, panic attacks, convulsions, insomnia. Weeks during which you'll have to face what you've become. That's scarier than a rotting leg. You thank him politely, take the brochure, promise to think about it, and as soon as he disappears around the corner, you toss it into the nearest trash can. The only clinic you need right now is the one in the small wax paper packet, but even this illusion of salvation will soon be shattered. One day you wake up not on a dirty mattress in an abandoned house, but in a dazzlingly white hospital room. The bright fluorescent light hits your eyes. For some reason, your hands are tied to the bed with soft restraints. Your mouth is as dry as a desert. Your tongue sticks to the roof of your mouth. A doctor in a blue uniform is sitting next to you. He speaks calmly, measuredly, but his words are like sledgehammer blows to the head. A severe systemic infection. sepsis. We did everything we could to save the leg, but the necrosis had gone too far. We had to amputate. You don't understand right away. And then slowly, with incredible effort, you look under the thin hospital blanket. Where your left leg was, there is now emptiness. A flat, tightly bandaged emptiness. You don't scream, you don't cry, you just stare at the white ceiling. In that moment, you understand with absolute clarity that xylazine didn't just take your leg. It took your last ghostly hope. It had won, finally and irrevocably. You are discharged a few weeks later with a cheap temporary prosthesis, a prescription for antibiotics, and a list of addresses for shelters and support groups. You walk out of the gleaming hospital doors on crutches. The world seems alien, deafening, hostile. People on the street look at you with a squeamish mixture of pity and disgust. You slowly, hobbling, walk the familiar streets of Kensington, and you see them. Dozens, hundreds, just like you, only in different stages of decay. Some stand, bent over in a trank stupor. Others sit on the sidewalk, intently picking at their non-healing ulcers. Others, like you, hobble on prosthetics or get around in wheelchairs donated by charities. This is an army of the defeated, an army of the living dead, and you are its new soldier. In your pocket are $100 they gave you for the time being. It's enough for either food and a bed at a shelter, or for a few baggies of trank dope. The choice is obvious. Withdrawal is already starting to bore into your spine from the inside with a cold drill. You find your dealer. He looks at your amputated leg without the slightest surprise, just shakes his head. "That's rough, man," he says, and hands you the coveted baggie. You take it with a trembling hand. You find a secluded corner between stinking trash cans. You take out the syringe. But now everything is different. There are no more veins in your arms. They've all burned out, turned into hard, impenetrable scars. You have to inject into your neck, into the carotid artery. It's deadly dangerous, you know. One wrong millimeter, and it's an instant stroke or death. But there's no fear. There's only fatigue, an endless, leaden, all-consuming exhaustion with yourself. The needle enters the skin, a push of the plunger, and the world goes dark again. But this time, sinking into the familiar black void, you pray for only one thing, not to wake up, ever. But the system that created this hell was far more cruel and had no intention of letting its victims go so easily. The legacy of xylazine turned out to be more terrifying than the drug itself. It poisoned not only bodies, but the entire support system that had been painstakingly built over decades to combat the opioid epidemic. First, it completely nullified the main tool of salvation, naloxone. Volunteers, police officers, and even family members of addicts, accustomed to having an antidote, now faced situations in despair where a person would die in their arms despite 3, 4, 5 administered doses. This created a wave of burnout and fatalism among those on the front lines of this war. Secondly, xylazine created a completely new medical problem of unprecedented scale, an epidemic of necrotic ulcers. Harm reduction centers, which previously focused on distributing syringes and condoms, were forced to transform into field hospitals on the fly. Social workers with no medical training learned to perform complex bandaging, treat rotting wounds, and persuade people to see a doctor. But hospitals were completely unprepared for such an influx of patients with such specific and complex injuries. Treatment required rare antibiotics, hours-long surgical operations to remove dead tissue, and prolonged hospitalization, which was practically impossible for people without insurance or a permanent residence. Thirdly, xylazine fundamentally changed the very psychology of addiction. The deep, hours-long trank state made people completely vulnerable. They would wake up robbed, beaten, or raped, often with no memory of what had happened. This exacerbated their psychological trauma, driving them into an even deeper pit of despair and self-destruction. The fear of the agonizing double withdrawal from fentanyl and xylazine made voluntarily seeking treatment nearly impossible. Detoxification centers across the country reported that patients simply could not endure it and would flee, unable to bear the combination of physical agony and uncontrollable psychological anxiety. The system, designed for opioid addicts, proved powerless against this new hybrid monster. The official response was criminally slow and inadequate. While a genuine humanitarian catastrophe was unfolding on the streets of Philadelphia, long bureaucratic debates were taking place at the federal level about whether to add xylazine to the list of controlled substances. The pharmaceutical and veterinary lobbies actively objected, fearing it would complicate the drug's legal use and create unnecessary barriers for business. Years passed before the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, and the White House officially recognized the fentanyl-xylazine mixture as a growing threat to the nation. During this time, the virus had not only managed to spread, but also to mutate. While in 2020, xylazine was predominantly a Philadelphia problem, by 2023, its traces were being detected in wastewater and autopsies in 48 out of 50 states. It appeared on the West Coast in Los Angeles and San Francisco, cities that had previously had almost no contact with it. Analysis of street drugs showed that dealers across the country were quickly and effectively adopting the Philadelphia business model. The monster born in Kensington embarked on a bloody tour across America. The most frightening thing about the xylazine story is that it is not unique. It has merely, with merciless clarity, exposed a fundamental, innate flaw in the entire global system of drug control. The system always reacts rather than prevents. It is always one step behind the ruthless, inventive logic of the black market, which is constantly searching for new, cheaper, stronger, and, most importantly, not yet banned substances. Today, it is xylazine. Tomorrow it could be another veterinary drug, an industrial chemical, or a new designer drug synthesized in one of the thousands of unregulated laboratories in China or India. And each time, the system will be unprepared. Each time, the first victims will be the most vulnerable, poor, and desperate. And society will once again look at them with judgment and fear, not understanding that these people are not the cause of the problem, but its most horrific, rotting alive consequence. In the dark corners of the internet, on anonymous forums, and in desperate whispered conversations on the streets of Kensington, a new, sinister paranoia is being born. What if none of this is an accident? What if the emergence of xylazine is not just a market fluctuation, but a targeted cleanup operation? It is too perfectly suited for the role of a weapon against undesirable elements. It doesn't just kill, it does so slowly, agonizingly, stripping away human appearance, turning entire neighborhoods into horror movie sets, causing ordinary people to recoil and demand that the authorities clean up the streets at any cost. This conspiracy theory resonates deeply because it offers a simple and understandable explanation for an inexplicable horror. It is easier to believe in the malicious intent of some secret enemy than in the fact that the system designed to protect is so blind, inert, and indifferent to the suffering of its citizens. It is easier to imagine a faceless puppet master who is intentionally poisoning people than to admit that this poison was created by the very combination of poverty, despair, corporate greed, government inaction, and universal indifference. But the truth is, perhaps, even more terrifying. The enemy is not a specific person or organization. The enemy is the system itself, in which a human life is worth less than the profit from selling a cheap chemical and the political points from tough rhetoric. Xylazine is not an anomaly. It is a logical and predictable product of a world where on one end of the earth a new molecule is synthesized in a sterile laboratory, and on the other, a person driven to the brink of despair is ready to inject it into their vein, just to forget their unbearable pain for a few hours. And this system has not gone away. It continues to operate. Right now, in thousands of laboratories around the world, new molecules are being created and tested. And one of them is perhaps already waiting for its moment to become the next trank, the next zombie drug. And when it appears, we will once again be unprepared, because we stubbornly treat the symptoms while refusing to acknowledge the disease itself. And the disease is a world in which such a thing is even possible.